We test theories against facts. And when the facts don't correspond to the theories, you don't throw out the facts. You throw out the theory. And you know what those emergency generators aren't powered by? They're powered by diesel fuel, a fossil fuel. Why would they do that? Reliability is the most important thing, not cost. I want an adaptable society. An adaptable society is one that does not lock itself in to solving the wrong problem. My name is H. Sterling Burnett. I have a PhD in applied philosophy. My specialization is environmental ethics. I have for, sadly enough, more than 30 years, part-time for about 5 years and full-time for more than 25, worked on environment, energy, and climate issues, which tells you I'm getting old. And I basically work from the premise that the worth of humans, human life, human values, human freedom should be the primary focus of our own lives and governments as they act on our behalf, and that but in exercising their freedom, they can harm environmental goods that are valuable to us, and they can benefit the environment, but that the environment itself should not restrain human freedom, except where actions in the environment violate basic human rights.
Thank you very much. That was a very extensive introduction. Can I ask you, what is your position on climate change? Do you think it's changing? It's not changing? Do you think CO2 is the factor? Do you think people are at all at fault, or you think it's a natural cycle? What is going on?
When discussing climate change, we must be clear. Climate changes and has always changed. The climate, as it's defined in science, are 30-year periods. And some areas, climate doesn't change for hundreds and thousands of years. Some changes fairly rapidly, sometimes in response to human activities, sometimes in response to natural factors. The present era of modestly warming temperatures and climate change, it's not global. It's the average is just we take data from all over the world and we tote it up and we say, oh, that's the average temperature. But the truth is, climate in some areas is changing, and in other areas it's not changing that much. The extent to which humans are contributing to this is a hot topic of debate. More importantly, even if humans are contributing to this, whether this constitutes a crisis, which is the focus of your conference, is even more a topic of reasonable debate. And I say this because, as I said, climate changes. Modestly warmer temperatures, historically, human societies have flourished and done better during warmer periods in history, and they have declined, and lifespans have dropped off. Societies have collapsed. Entire villages have disappeared when temperatures fell and crops failed and the ice expanded.
You just mentioned data. My question is, when you go on the open source internet or anything and you start looking for statistics as far as what is the temperature, is it on the rise, what's going on with CO2, and especially, and then you start going and see how many hurricanes there are the winds getting stronger, and so on and so forth. Depending on what is you're looking for, you will be able to find proof to any possible statistics you're looking for. So my question to you, which statistics we could trust, and which ones are you relying on?
Now, cherry picking of the data is a serious problem in science and outside of science, where you choose data that supports your position and you ignore the data that would seem to undermine your position. It's especially a problem in climate science. For proxy data in the past, some scientists use tree ring data. Tree ring data is a perfectly valid way of doing it. But you shouldn't pick some trees and not other trees just because some trees show warming and other trees don't show warming. If they cover the same period of time and there's contradictory data from the full panoply instead of trees, you don't throw out some that confirm your hypothesis and accept others. Now, as I've said, there is very little doubt that temperatures have risen since at least the early 1980s. And they rose before based on, valid temperature measurements collected by temperature gauges all over the globe. I say all over the globe. We've actually improved the measuring system a lot in the last 100 years. But the data that we have from where we have it across the globe showed that temperatures rose as we came out of something called the Little Ice Age around the middle of the 19th century, the 1850s, 1870s or so. So temperatures rose through the 1930s. And in the US, at least, we had our worst heat waves during the 1930s, the Dust Bowl. More than half the record heat temperatures in the US were set in the 1930s. They haven't been broken. There's 2 years in the 1930s that set more record heat than all the records that have been set since 2000. So it was warming then. Now, we hit a period from the 1940s through the late 1970s where the Earth was cooling modestly. And at the time, you saw a lot of scientific talk, discussions, papers, and front page headlines saying the Earth was cooling and we were facing the coming ice age. And then that changed and the year started warm again. And the world's governments through the UN formed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, you would think that would be studying climate change, but they specified that you study the human causes of climate change. So they ruled out all natural factors. They said, no, we're not going to study whether the sun plays a role. We're not going to study whether volcanoes play a role. We're not going to study whether large ocean current shifts play a role. And we're not going to study, we really don't understand clouds, so we're not going to count them much. What we're going to study is human CO2 emissions because that's what we can get a handle on. And I'm sorry, but if all you have is a hammer, the hammer being greenhouse gas emissions, then everything looks like a nail. So everything caused comes from human emissions. That's not the way science is supposed to work. Mm-hmm. But of course, it was not a scientific body. It's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, not the Interscientific or International Scientific Panel on Climate Change. That's because the people are appointed by governments and the governments have to approve the reports. That doesn't sound like a good way to conduct science to me.
Excellent. What proof do we have that current climate change is not caused by humans?
So the question is, to what extent is current climate change, which I don't know anyone who disputes is happening, is caused by humans and how we can prove it or not prove it? That's a difficult question. And they have tried to prove it through the use of what they called global circulation models, climate models for short. And what they do with these climate models is they insert what we understand about physics as a background. Then they make assumptions about what the climate would be like absent any greenhouse gas emissions and what it should be like with greenhouse gas emissions. But with a lot of technology, your outputs, in this case, the computer model simulations, of what future climate will look like, what present climate should look like, are only as good as the data you put into it and the assumptions you make. It's garbage in, garbage out. If you make faulty assumptions or incomplete assumptions, if you don't put in data, or if you have to because you don't really understand not just data, but sort of the physical properties of how the Earth operates very well, so you have to leave out large physical factors, your models are going to be weak because they're only as good as the accuracy of the stuff that's put in them. And global general circulation models are weak. They have, since their beginning, over-predicted the amount of warming that we have and should experience with the additional units of CO2. In part, that's because they make assumptions about the sensitivity of the Earth's climate to additional units of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And based on their outputs, we can pretty confidently say those assumptions are wrong, that models are oversensitive. And so I guess when you're looking at, we're often told we're in the midst of a climate crisis. And we face a climate crisis. Why? Well, you can talk about whatever other weather events or climate changes are happening, but it's all driven by temperature changes, the rise in what they call globally average temperatures. Now, climate models have failed to predict past temperatures or to accurately reflect past temperatures. They fail to accurately represent present temperatures, but we're told we can trust their projections of future temperatures. That doesn't seem reasonable to me. If you have to fudge the models to force them to accurately reflect past and present temperatures, I don't trust what they're saying about 50 and 100 years from now very much, nor should anyone else. Mm-hmm. If you can't trust their temperature projections, why should you project anything else, trust anything else they predict about climate change based on those temperature projections? So when scientists began developing climate models, they would put inputs in primarily because this is, once again, what they were supposed to study, human greenhouse gas emissions, saying, here's the rate they're rising, here's the rate we anticipate them rising, or the rates we expect they will decline with technology change. And these are the temperatures that should result. But we have a data set. And since the late 1970s, we've had 3 data sets. So prior to the 1970s, we had 2 data sets. One was ground-based and ocean-based temperature stations. So we've got buoys on the ocean. We've started we started taking some data from sources that are very suspect in the oceans, which are ship engine intake, water intake manifolds. That's very suspicious, but the buoys are pretty clean. They're not affected by what we call the urban heat island effect, humans' impact on an area. So we've had the ground-based measurements for a good while. We've also been releasing weather balloons in the same locations a couple of times a day, every day, for a good long time. Then in the 70s, we had satellites that were put into the atmosphere that started measuring temperatures at different levels of the atmosphere. So we've got 3 sources of data. Climate models are developed. To verify them, you have to compare them to actual data from our sources of data. And from the very beginning, climate models indicated the Earth should be warmer than it is based on their inputs, their assumptions, the physics, greenhouse gas emission concentrations in the atmosphere. And they've not gotten better over time. We've been doing climate modeling for more than 30 years, and they still fail to accurately represent past temperatures without being literally forced to. Without literally, you take data from the Earth, you take data from the weather balloons, you take data from the satellites, and you just say, this is the data they're starting from. So it looks like they projected the past very accurately. And so this is what we should have in the future. But that's not what they do. In fact, they, without being forced to, they don't reflect past data from the three sources. They don't reflect presently measured temperatures around the globe without being forced to. And yet we are told, we're constantly warned about what they're projecting for future temperatures. Now, questions have arisen concerning if we were able to reach the goals of a Paris climate treaty or previous climate treaties, or the goal of net zero, which is humans not adding any additional greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. Now, net zero is not reducing concentrations. It's just saying we're not adding any additional on top of what nature constantly adds. What will its effect be on temperature? Well, the truth is we don't know. Why? Because the model's effects are the model's outputs of what we can say about temperature, and they don't accurately reflect temperatures. So we don't know what net zero will produce. Will it 100 years from now peak global temperatures at 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, which is what the goal is? The Paris Treaty set the goal of keeping globally average temperatures below 2 degrees rise as far as possible, hoping for 1.5. So if we get net zero, will we produce that? The models say we will, if we do it very quickly. But that's not clear because the models don't manage temperature well. I mean, even the IPCC had to admit their models are overwarming. So we actually may well keep temperatures below 1.5 to 2 degrees, and it may have nothing to do with getting to net zero. In fact, simple climate models, to understand part of the problem that I think is the problem behind climate models, you have to understand that it's not just the physics of climate and greenhouse gas emissions that are put into it, and assumptions. It's assumptions about what they call feedback mechanisms. So if the Earth warms, what will happen in other places? Will the permafrost melt and put even more methane and CO2 in the atmosphere? Will the snows go away? Will trees absorb more carbon dioxide? They make these feedback mechanism assumptions, but they don't understand the feedback mechanisms very well. And you can read the scientific literature and know that, because every day, almost, either a press report or a scientific report comes out projecting different futures for the same regions for 100 years into the future. So will monsoons be worse in India, or will they be better in India? Or will they stay the same? You can find data, not data, but reports, research, which indicates each of those three outcomes 100 years from now based on climate models. But it's all based on feedback mechanisms. Now, there is a set of models. They're not favored by the IPCC. One of them is a Russian model, which is simple. They don't assume the feedback mechanisms, and they just look at the physics of CO2 and the physics. So adding CO2 and physics with no feedback. And they produce about 1 degree Celsius of warming with increasing levels of CO2 up to a doubling. It's all called, it's all premised on a doubling of pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide. So I'm going to go into a little history. Mm-hmm. Over time, the Earth's, the atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide have radically fluctuated throughout the Earth's geologic history. They have been in the past as much as 5,000 parts per million. They are currently about 420 parts per million. So over long periods of time, they have fluctuated, but in general, they have fallen. The CO2 has been absorbed into the Earth's surface through plants and roots and soil. They have formed carbonaceous rocks, which are limestone. And most of the Earth's CO2 that was there when it was first born has been absorbed in that way. During the middle of the last ice age, the CO2 in the atmosphere reached about 180 parts per million. At 150 parts per million, plants die. They can no longer photosynthesize. And if plants die, all life on Earth goes away too. So we are getting dangerously close over time to the death of the planet because there's not enough CO2 to sustain plant life. Now, we came out of the ice age. And when they did, as has happened in previous interglacial cycles, periods between ice ages, CO2 rose dramatically. And it rose from about 180 parts per million to 280 parts per million, which is where it was, more or less, when we started the Industrial Revolution. And we started pumping additional units of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere above and beyond what the Earth was absorbing naturally, which leaves us where we are today. So, what does that mean for a future with net zero? Like I said, we don't know. You take out the feedback mechanisms, you've got these models that are simple models, and they say, well, it'll produce about 1 degree of warming. So the point is, if you follow the simple models track the temperature pretty well, measure temperatures pretty well. So you've got these models that project measured temperatures pretty well, and you've got these models that don't, that overstate warming, and yet the models that are the simple models that don't contain any feedback mechanisms are not the ones used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the UN. It's curious. It's curious, unless you think this is a political ploy rather than a scientific issue. So honestly, if the simple models are right, we go on the trajectory we're going now, which are our emissions are rising, but they're not rising as fast as they were, when we first started the Industrial Revolution, the rate of rise, I mean. Then as technology changes and improves, the rate of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rising should decline. Whether it ever reaches net zero, I can't project. I don't know. But it will decline. The rate of rise will decline. And if the simple models are right, we may cap out at 1 degree warming. And my suspicion is if temperatures cease to rise, the people who claimed that we were causing the end of the Earth through CO2 emissions will say, see, if we hadn't acted, we would have disaster, but thankfully we acted. And it's like, well, that's convenient. You did what simple models said would happen, and it produced those results, and now you're claiming credit.
It seems like we are being pushed into believing that CO2 is the factor. So basically, somebody is looking to blame us for climate change. What do they have to gain from it? Is it true? Is my statement is true? And why would they want to do that to us?
So why would people want us to believe that carbon dioxide emissions are bad for the planet when they're demonstrably not bad for the planet? Once again, we're all carbon-based life forms. Without carbon, it's over. Game over. Plants need it, and they're thriving under it. But they want us to believe that carbon dioxide, that they have a God's eye point of view. They stand above it all, and they look down and they say, this is the optimum temperature. This is the optimum level of carbon dioxide. We know that. Well, first off, I don't have much faith in people having, if any person or a group of people having a God's eye point of view and knowing that. But I could be wrong. Maybe there is an optimum temperature and an optimum level of CO2. I don't know who knows it, but I could be wrong. And so if I'm right, however, the question is, if the data is what it indicates, the question is, why would you push to end carbon dioxide emissions? Not just carbon dioxide emissions, various other things, some of which are, traditional pollutants. I wouldn't be happy to bring them in very often. Anything can be a danger. Water is a danger. Now, and I'm not just talking about drowning. I mean, we all know if you ingest water the wrong way, you breathe it rather than swallow it, you're going to die unless you've sprouted gills and now you're a fish. But you can drink too much of it. It can it could mess up your electrolyte balance and you can die. You drink it the right way and there's just too much of it in your system. Well, that's true of CO2, but it had to be much higher than any levels anyone's reasonably expecting. So it's not the traditional pollutant. It's not toxic at the levels we're seeing. They call it a pollutant because they say the accumulation in the atmosphere is causing climate change. Why would they do this? Okay, I'm not a psychologist, don't claim to be one. I can't get into people's, I don't know how other people think. I can't get into someone else's head. I can make assumptions about why they do what they do based on a variety of factors, but I can't know it. So there are some people who I believe really believe humans are causing dangerous climate change and really, or really believe, even if they don't think humans are causing dangerous climate change, they love the environment, a particular time slice of how the environment was, or they'd like it to be in history before European conquest of the North American continent, before the Vikings, pick your time period. They think that's the way the earth should be. They have a moral vision, a normative vision of the way the world should be. And they see industrialization, which involves CO2 emissions, as interfering with that moral vision coming about. And so they've leapt on the climate bandwagon, or they really believe it. So there's one group of people that really believes humans are causing climate change and it's bad for humans or the environment. There's another group of people who see it as a cause to obtain other goals. So they want to talk about social justice, or they want to talk about gender equity, or they want to talk about getting rid of capitalism because they hate capitalism and they like socialism. I think that's because they think they'll be in charge if under a socialist regime. They won't be under their own thumb. So they're using climate change as a cause to reach other goals. Then there are the politicians. I don't know. Most politicians that I know are about power. And they may be about power for their own gain, or they may be about power because they are paternalist. They have a vision of the way the world would be, and they think it would be better. And they're willing to force that on you because they think you're not smart enough to know how to live your own life. And if you only did what I wanted, if the world were only like I would design it, you'd be happy. You'd be in paradise. You don't understand that. You're not smart enough to understand that, but I am. And so you got two types of politicians that do it for gain, politicians that do it for paternalistic reasons. And then you got a very small subset of politicians who are really there to help people follow their own lights and thrive and flourish. But I think they're vanishingly small. And I think even some who started out that way, just through the political process, are ground down to become one of the other two. The scientific community, well, I don't know. Some scientists, I think, really believe it. Other scientists, I think, do it out of fear of what their colleagues think. Imagine you came up in the last 20 years as a young climate scientist, and you do your data, and it doesn't show climate change is happening. First off, you're having a difficult time getting published because journals don't want to hear it. Well, that affects your tenure track position, and your colleagues are frowning at you, and you're not getting government grants because government doesn't give grants to study natural factors of climate change or to study things that prove humans aren't causing climate change, because government has a motive, expanding its reach. So you're in a bind. You suffer if, I'm not saying all of them, their research honestly finds that humans aren't causing more hurricanes or that CO2 is not driving climate change. But I find it curious that when I often see in studies, you wouldn't have seen this 50 years ago. A study is done and it says, there's a fear humans are causing climate change, and that's going to affect X, Y, or Z. We've done research to see how X, Y, and Z are being affected by human greenhouse gas emissions. Our data does not show it's being affected by human greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not saying climate change isn't happening. We're not saying humans aren't causing it. Our data doesn't show it, but that's okay. You know, you don't have to believe our data because we're saying the right things. Humans are causing climate change. Our data just doesn't reflect it. And we can't figure that out. We'll figure it out sometime. So I know many authors who've been suppressed, and I know researchers who've left the field because they feel like they can't give their honest assessment and get it either published or get tenure because their colleagues are raking in huge sums of government money by saying humans are causing climate change. And I guess that's the last point on that, is that more money has been devoted to climate research in the past 15 years than was devoted to climate research cumulatively worldwide prior to that. Billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, have gone into climate research. And that goes away. I'm constantly told the science is settled. Well, if the science is settled, let's just move on to policy and stop funding the scientists because it's settled. I don't know any scientist that says the science is settled and we need no more money because we've got the answers. I don't know that scientist. Mm-hmm. The science is settled, but we need more money for research. That's the scientist I know. And that is hypocrisy. We've answered the questions, but we need more money to continue studying the questions. That doesn't work.
So what I would like to ask you is that to come back to this pro CO2 or against CO2. And nowadays we see that it is becoming more than politics. It is becoming more like religion. And is it the way to get to the bottom of this by having constructive discussion? Should it be done or can this be done?
I have stood on stage with a number of scientists, 7 or 8, were researchers who believe carbon dioxide emissions are driving dangerous climate change. And so I test whether it's a science or a religion, because it seems to be a religion to me. And how you test that is the theory disconfirmable? Is it possible they could be wrong? And so I asked them, I say, look, I know what it would take for me to believe that humans were causing dangerous climate change. And I asked them, what would it take for you to believe the theory is wrong that humans are causing dangerous climate change? Now, 6 of those 7 or 8, they had no answer at all. They couldn't give conditions that would disprove their theory. That tells me it's not a scientific theory, it's a religion. If there are no conditions under which they could be wrong, that's not science. Now, there's a role for faith in people's lives. I'm a religious person myself. But I don't let my religion cloud my fealty to the scientific method, which says any theory can be disproven in theory, at least. And the more likely, the more that a theory's projections of what should occur if something happens are accurate, then it's more likely to be true. but something could come along to overturn it tomorrow. That's how science works. Now, the seventh scientist, he had an answer. And his answer was all of physics would have to be overturned. Really? The laws of conservation of energy? The Big Bang Theory? Notions of entropy and disentropy? All of that has to go for you to be wrong about whether humans are causing dangerous climate change? Yes, he said. Now, it's an answer. I'll give him credit for that, but it's extreme hubris, it seems to me. That everything, he said, everything I know about physics would have to be overturned. Wow. That's quite a demand. To be wrong about one portion of physics, that he's still getting research money, despite the fact he says the science is settled. To be wrong about that one portion of science, climate science, all other physics has to be overturned. That's hubris. Now, another scientist, he had what I think to be the right answer. I mean, there is an answer. And he had what I think to be, he said, time. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. See, what happens is over time, they keep making predictions. And the predictions keep proving either correct or wrong. And if they keep proving to be wrong, and he admitted they've been wrong so far, then you finally give up the theory and say we have to come up with a new theory why things are happening the way they're happening. And I thought, what an enlightened point of view. In fact, you might even call it the point of view that comes from the Enlightenment. We test theories against facts. And when the facts don't correspond to the theories, you don't throw out the facts. You throw out the theory. I don't know if you can't convince the scientist, I guess you have to convince the public, but it's hard to do that when journalists, supposed journalists, say we won't allow scientific skeptics. They label us deniers, as if the theory of climate change 100 years from now, the projections of 100 years from now, are as certain as the Holocaust was 50 years ago. One we have a lot of evidence for. A lot of bodies piled up, a lot of pictures, a lot of memories stored, facts, and the other is projections. But they think the projections are as solid as that. You got to convince people that it's not. That they're fair. That I won't say they're fairy tales, but they're scare stories. Mm-hmm. Look at what is accomplished, and then you ask yourself, what's accomplished if we get rid of CO2? Well, if we really get rid of it, we're all dead. Now, we do know we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere. It doesn't have to linger in the atmosphere. We have methods of doing it. They're just expensive. And then the question is, okay, since we know how to do it technically, and we have the technology to do it, at what expense do we reach net zero? How much are we willing to spend to reach net zero through removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And that's not a question, it seems to me, of dollars and cents. That's a question of opportunity costs. Because it's not how much money we would be willing to spend, it's how many other things will we not be able to do with that money that are important if we focus on removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Resources are not infinite. And if you take scarce resources and you devote them to one cause, they are of necessity not going to other causes. So if we focus on removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the exclusion of, or to the extent that we focus on removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because we don't have to do both to the exclusion of, but any money devoted to that is not going towards helping people develop as fast as possible. If you want to say, well, we're preventing an additional X amount of sea level rise 100 years from now, okay, how many generations of people in poor countries have to die today, have to be allowed to die today by not being allowed to develop to make that happen? Is it worth it? I'm an ethicist, and I think it's immoral to say present generations of poor have to remain in poverty so wealthy people who have beachfront homes don't get their feet wet 100 years from now. Especially when I think most of them don't really believe that. We have a president of the United States named Barack Obama. He retired. And when he retired, he bought a new home, despite 8 years of warning us that seas were rising dangerously, that our coast would be flooded and swamped. Where did he buy his home? On a barrier island less than a foot above sea level. Now that tells me he either doesn't believe his home is going to be flooded 100 years from now, or he doesn't care what happens 100 years from now, for his daughters or granddaughters, grandchildren, whoever they are, or he's really, really overinsured his home and is waiting for the money to roll in when his home floods. Now, I don't know which of those it is, but my suspicion is he doesn't believe his home is going to be flooded 100 years from now. But based on the idea that seas are going to rise, and by the way, seas have risen 400 feet since the last ice age ended, and they will continue to rise till the next ice age comes, because that's what happens during interglacial periods. That's what the data shows. The question is, how many people will not have resources today? We're asking people in developing countries, don't develop, or at least don't develop like the West did, which means don't develop, which means we'll give you technologies that work some of the time, wind and solar, some batteries. And you just have to suffer because we're worried about what happens 100 years from now. So present generations of your children and your children's children have to continue to starve, won't be able to go to hospitals at night, won't have running water, will have to go to the well and draw it. Hours of backbreaking labor. They have to continue to live like that. So 100 years from now, New York isn't flooded. Well, I've been to New York, a lot of good things to say about it, but I don't think New Yorkers have any moral right to not get their feet wet compared to people in developing countries not being able to eat today or have modern medical technologies or modern agricultural technologies or modern energy systems. That's immoral.
Would you say a few words about new eco-green technology? I mean, I'm talking wind and solar. Are they as reliable as they claim to be? Can everything be, like fossil fuel plants, be replaced with them anytime soon without any loss?
So people want to talk about green technologies, and they usually, not always, but usually are talking about wind turbines and solar panels and battery backup. The cost of these, because in part because governments poured a lot of money into it. When the government pours money into it, private sector pours money into it. The cost of these has fallen dramatically. But that doesn't mean they're good sources of energy. To some extent, it doesn't matter how cheap a source of energy is if it actually doesn't provide energy when you need it. In modern societies, you want a modern electrical system, modern power grid. And we developed one in the United States over 100 years, where you could count on, when I came home from work, 99.9% of the time, if I flicked on the lights would come on. If I came home on a hot Texas day, that's where I'm located. And Texas days, I remember when in my youth, we had 56 straight days of over 100 temperatures once. They're hot. You expect heat in the summer. And I honestly don't know how people lived here 150 years ago. Probably they were tougher than me. But I want my air conditioner to run. And so I expect it to run because I had a modern power system. We are taking a modern power system that does not depend on the weather for the most part and turning it into a power system that's like something from the 19th or 18th century, where, once again, we're praying to the weather gods to work so we have our power when we demand it. And I hope my meat or whatever I have in the freezer doesn't thaw out because the wind wasn't blowing that day and it was rainy, or I'm sorry, the sun doesn't shine at night. Never, ever. It's dark. Solar power is not generating energy. Oh, well, we've got battery backups. Well, the battery backups, how long do they last? How much power has to be diverted from solar to charge those batteries during the day? Which means it's not available for use for other things. The wind doesn't always blow. In fact, there are regions where the wind is quiet most of the time. You don't want to build a modern power system based on technologies that only work when the weather conditions are right. That's not a wise decision, no matter how cheap the technology itself is. You want your hospital functioning 24 hours a day. You want your emergency services operating 24 hours a day. You don't want your phone system going down if you need to call the police. And so what do? Well, most hospitals, most police stations, most fire departments in the United States, I can't speak once again for other countries, they have emergency generators. And you know what those emergency generators aren't powered by? Wind, solar, or batteries. They're powered by diesel fuel, a fossil fuel. Why would they do that? Reliability is the most important thing, not cost. And that's the one thing, frankly, wind and solar aren't cheap. They're cheaper than they used to be, but they're not cheap. But even if they were cheap, that's not the primary consideration. That shouldn't be the primary consideration for a modern electric system. Reliability should be. And so you don't build one that's that you know is unreliable. That's madness. All the batteries in the world wouldn't keep the United States lights on for 2 days. Modern power grids, modern power systems in the United States, ones powered by fossil fuels, nuclear, to a lesser extent, hydropower, they're expected to keep the lights on during an emergency up to 60 days. You want that kind of storage. You want that kind of backup. What you don't want is the ability to only have 2 days power backing you up, or 2 hours power backing you up, which is actually more likely the case, because not all batteries in the world are tailored to keeping America's lights on. I want to say, and I want to aim this at the youth of the world. Ask yourselves how you live. If you're concerned about climate change, if you're really, really concerned about climate change, and you think humans are causing it and it's dangerous, ask yourself if your life reflects that. Are you giving up your cell phone? Because if you want to get rid of fossil fuels not only just power that cell phone, charge it, but the very plastics that they're made of are made from petroleum products. You don't have them without fossil fuels. Do you live in a modern structure that has any steel in it? Are you willing to give it up? Because steel takes coal to produce from iron. Are you willing to give up your Kindle? Anyone who uses any of these technologies, who relies on them daily, I can't imagine trying to take my cell phone from my niece, no matter how worried she may be about climate change. I'd probably get clubbed about the head and neck if I tried to take the cell phone. I'm trying to save you. I'd say, I'm trying to save you. I don't want you to die from climate change. Leave my cell phone alone. I can see it now. I'm going to get beat. Does your lifestyle reflect your belief? And if it doesn't, either re-examine your lifestyle or re-examine your belief. But don't tell past generations that are still around that they ruined the planet, that they're killing you, because quite frankly, they've made your life a lot better. You have modern conveniences. You have cell phones. You have computers. That didn't happen because they fell from heaven.
Yes, I would like to ask following question. So essentially, along with observation of statistic on weather event, we also pay attention on the publications on geodynamic changes. And what we observe is that that it's a good amount of publications, which is talking about the magnetic field weakening, seismic and volcanic activity is increasing, and activation of magma sources beneath Antarctica and Greenland, and Gulf Stream is slowing down. And all these changes, they cannot be explained by carbon dioxide emissions. And are you familiar with these studies, and what are the driving factors behind all this?
What I know is, like King Canute before, whose courtiers tried to convince him that he was so powerful he could stop the rising tides, he went and stood and said, "It doesn't seem to be working. You know, I don't seem to have that kind of power." We don't have the power to control the climate or the weather. There are lots of factors, and we do know some of them are ramping up. I don't understand all of them. I've seen research that indicates the Gulf Stream is speeding up, but I've also seen research that says the Gulf Stream is slowing down. I don't know which is the case. I do know, because I've studied this a lot, that volcanic activity, subsurface volcanic activity in Antarctica and even in parts of Greenland and Iceland are contributing to the melting of the glaciers there. That is not controlled by CO2. We don't control the ocean currents. We don't control the magnetism of the Earth and how it shifts or can shift over time, magnetic poles. We don't control our orbit. Now, maybe this is why the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change focused on the human causes of climate change, because there are so many factors that affect stuff that we don't control. But that doesn't mean that just because that's what we're studying and that's what we're focusing on, that we have that control if these other factors are at play. And they almost certainly are. So we need to understand them, because the most effective response to a changing climate is understanding what's causing it and preparing for it. If you can't control the causes, you prepare for the worst possible outcome. And to the extent that you can, well, you do what you can. We don't control those things. And they're really what's driving. That's why we should study them. Because if they're really what's driving climate change and we think it's bad, we should know that too. Rather than expending a lot of resources trying to control CO2, maybe we should spend a lot of resources hardening ourselves, making our societies more adaptable to whatever climate change occurs, whether the weather becomes colder or hotter. I want an adaptable society. An adaptable society is one that does not lock itself in to solving the wrong problem.
Wonderful. Thank you. Amazing answer.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really, it's a really great answer. Thank you very much, Dr. Burnett. And may I ask you, just there is another question which we had, is that have you heard about the global warming observed on other planets, like in Mars and other planets and satellites?
Have you, while you answer that, have there been a CO2 on the rise there as well? Human cause, maybe?
Just like climate change occurred on Earth long before there were any factories or automobiles or anything else, climates on other planets are beyond human control. And they, more effectively than almost anything, show nature still rules the roost. Now, Venus, it's covered with CO2, but I'm not talking a little bit. And it's also a lot closer to the sun. And it's very, very hot. There's not one coal-fired power plant on the planet that we've been able to discern through our satellites going through their cloudy atmosphere. So the physics of other planets, I don't think necessarily tells us much about the physics of this planet. Studying Mars, there's some evidence that I haven't studied Mars myself, but I've read a lot. I've read a modicum amount that there's some evidence that Mars used to have water, and maybe it was a planet more similar to ours. We don't really know why that's not the case now. We speculate, we have theories, but none of them is yet to be proven, I think. What we can be pretty confident about is that whatever the cause of Mars's current state, it had nothing to do with human greenhouse gas emissions. And if we ever terraform Mars, and people are talking about doing that, it will only be possible because we start emitting greenhouse gas emissions in something like a greenhouse. We're going to have to erect structures that we have oxygen and CO2 and things in so we can grow plants there. We can't do it today. We will want more CO2 on Mars if we want to set up colonies there or anywhere else. We have to have conditions that are pretty much like they are on Earth. And what we know is plants and animals thrived historically in conditions where CO2 was much higher than today's levels.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think I would like to come to our last questions. And the question is that how it is important for people on the planet to unite, and how important the life of humans should be for our society.
Based on the Earth's history, we can expect another ice age. When that ice age comes, large areas of the globe will become uninhabitable without huge amounts of effort to keep the ice off of them, which means more of the Earth's populations will move towards the equators. That's responding to nature. Are there common causes that all humans should be able to get behind, that we could join together and work towards? I think there are. Reducing poverty in developed and developing countries alike. Reducing hunger in developing and developed countries alike, because even in developed countries, there are pockets of hunger. Helping people find housing, and more importantly, helping people discover ways to deliver to themselves meaningful lives. People can't give you self-esteem. You have to earn it. Work helps you develop self-esteem. Work helps you develop meaningful lives and helps you dream of better things for yourself and to be able to deliver better things for yourself. So helping people find meaningful work. Technologies do that all the time. They sometimes destroy older industries and create new ones. But we're on an upward trajectory if we don't shoot ourselves in the foot. The Earth will be around and life will be around long after we're gone unless we do something to screw it up. And human greenhouse gas emissions are not that thing, because CO2 has been beneficial for life on Earth for as long as life on Earth has existed.
I do appreciate everything you've said, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, I appreciate y'all having me on. I appreciate you reaching out.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burnett. I would say that it was really amazing conversation.
No lie lasts forever. Truth always triumphs. Now is the time for the truth. We will give you the facts of historical deception of all of humanity. In the year 1992, a 12-year-old environmental activist, Severn Suzuki,
I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in our ozone. I am afraid to breathe the air.
the year 2018, a 16-year-old eco-activist, Greta Thunberg,
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words. On my generation, sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2.
Interesting, isn't it? An old song written by the Cooks of Lies has been played again after 27 years. So what is the reason for such ardent performances by young eco-activists? In 1989, the Montreal Protocol was signed. The major scarecrow for people was the ozone holes. This scam destroyed the world's refrigeration industry and allowed billions to be made on this swindle. The ozone holes did not disappear, but the pockets swelled with dollars. 97, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. The main problem is the infamous CO2. Greenhouse gases are now a new commodity. As the total climate finance average in 2019-2020 alone amounted to $632 billion US. A new global scam that is profitable for those cooks in the kitchen of lies. These subhumans exploit children, pleading for sympathy. Aren't you sick of it? To slurp down a stinky broth of lies and pay for it with your hard-earned money. The climate fight today is a big, cruel business. We are forced to toil away for food and shelter and to pay for air. The climate attacks and kills us mercilessly. It spares no one and takes no money. Cataclysms are escalating rapidly, and they are becoming stronger and more synchronized. Let's not be silent any longer. It's time for the truth. It is time to act. Let's bring the whole world together at the Forum on May 7th, 2022.